All right, y'all, let's get started. I'm Royce Brooks. I am the Executive Director of Annie's List. I am incredibly excited, as our whole team is, for today's conversation. But before we get started, I'd love to share with y'all a little bit about who we are at Annie's List and what it is we do. Over the last 17 years, Annie's List has elected more than 140 progressive women all across Texas, trained thousands of folks, and invested over $19 million to build women's political power. We know Texas from El Paso to Houston and from Dallas to the Valley. And we know firsthand that Texas is the biggest battleground state because at Annie's List, we've been doing the work to make it that way. And right now, we're only 9 seats away from flipping the Texas House to Democratic control in November. This November, we're going to elect more women than ever in our history. We're going to send a record number of women to the Texas Ledge. And fun fact, y'all, the Texas House has never elected a woman as Speaker. This cycle, we have the chance not only to flip the House to Democratic control, but to see a progressive woman elected Speaker for the first time in the history of our state. Now, y'all know that we're living through an unprecedented moment of crisis on a global scale. There are those who warn us not to politicize this crisis, but the fact is that this crisis is the direct result of our politics. From the cruel, fear-driven leadership of the president to the years of irresponsible, short-sighted disinvestment in our communities under Texas's Republican leadership. Because of politics, Texas has the largest uninsured population in the country during a global pandemic. Because of politics, families all over Texas are struggling through this moment without paid family or medical leave. Because of politics, Texans are being forced to choose between exercising their right to vote and their health and that of their children. But the solutions that will keep people safe are the same solutions our Annie's List champions stand for. Elections have consequences, y'all, and our work continues. So with that, I'm incredibly excited to introduce the Reverend Dr. William Barber. Reverend Barber is a pastor and social justice advocate building a broad-based grassroots movement grounded in the moral tenets of faith-based communities and the Constitution to confront systemic racism, poverty, environmental devastation, the war economy, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism in America today. As pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina since 1993, and former president of the North Carolina Conference of the NAACP, Reverend Barber approaches social justice through the lens of the ethical and moral treatment of people as laid out in the Christian Bible, the Reconstruction and civil rights movements of the South, and the United States Constitution. He builds unusually inclusive coalitions that are multiracial and interfaith, reaching across race, gender, age, and class lines, and dedicated to addressing poverty, inequality, and systemic racism. When his work to expand voting rights, healthcare, living wages, immigrant rights, public education, and LGBTQ rights was thwarted by extremist state lawmakers in North Carolina, Reverend Barber began a series of Moral Monday rallies outside of the State House in Raleigh to protest laws that suppressed voter turnout, cut funding for public education and healthcare, and further disenfranchised poor, white, Black, First Nations people, and LGBTQ communities. The Moral Mondays rallies and associated nonviolent acts of civil disobedience grew to involve tens of thousands of participants across North Carolina and spread to states across the South. The movement waged successful legal challenges to voter suppression and racial gerrymandering, winning twice at the Supreme Court of the United States. In 2014, Reverend Barber founded Repairers of the Breach, a leadership development organization to expand and build a national movement rooted in moral analysis, moral articulation, and moral action. In 2016, he led a moral revival tour that covered 26 states and attracted thousands. In 2017, he and colleagues launched a revival of the 1968 Poor People's Campaign that was spearheaded by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others. Beginning with an audit of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and the war economy in the United States since 1968, the campaign has been recast for the 21st century, building state and local, nonpartisan fusing movements committed to shifting the moral narrative, building power, and challenging laws and policies that hurt the poor and threaten our democracy. Reverend Barber has received 8 honorary doctorates, and in 2019, he received the Hubert H. Humphrey Award for Civil and Human Rights. He has been a member of the National Board of the NAACP since 2005, and he is also a distinguished visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary. Reverend Barber is a published co-author and a contributing op-ed writer for The Guardian, The New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, and The Washington Post. Reverend Barber, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you.
Hello.
Hello. How
are you today?
Doing well. Thank you for joining us. We've been incredibly excited anticipating this conversation, and I'd love to jump right in.
Great. And let me welcome and say thank you to all of the folk at Annie's List. I've been reading about why you all got started, challenging Karl Rove, and I've just been doing this. And as you said, this, you know you don't win if you don't fight. But we've always known if we fight, we win. And if we fight, we may not win, but we can create a situation for others to win. And you're from Texas, right?
I am born and raised in Fort Worth. I live in Austin now.
In Austin. I'll give you a little nugget. In 1960, about 6, when my parents were making their trek back to the South from Indiana, they had gotten a call after the March on Washington from a Black principal who asked my daddy to come home to help integrate the schools, because 12 years after Brown, schools in the South had still, as you know, had still not integrated or even tried to desegregate it all, let alone integrate. And we made a stop through Jarvis, Texas for a year and a half. So a year and a half, I stayed in Jarvis, Texas, and my father helped build a program there at Jarvis Christian College.
That's fantastic. And that is enough for us to call you a Texan as well. Welcome home in a way.
Thank you.
I'd love to say, you've spent years advocating for change. Talk to us about what drove you to social justice and to grassroots movement building in the first place.
I can't remember in my household where I was not taught that to believe in Jesus is to believe in justice and there's no separation. And that story that I just told you is actually what brought me into it. My father and mother gave up what could have been a very lucrative life in Indiana, a life where their only child at the time would not have had to experience segregation, because Indiana had done some moving forward, not a whole lot, because Indiana was also the home of one of the most vicious forms of the Klan, particularly out in the North. But in some ways, my father had earned 2 degrees in Indiana. My mother was working high up in government, but they got a call. And my father felt called to respond to the call and to come home. And in fact, the opening chapter in my book, Third Reconstruction, is going home. Going home has been something that has happened in my family time and time again. And so I entered segregated public schools in the 1968. And I was a part of the group that helped desegregate schools. My mother desegregated high schools. My father helped desegregate high schools. And I grew up in a household of activism and have been engaged. And my father didn't just go back to help Black people. He went back and made a life out of focusing on workers and workers' rights and union rights, and encouraging and empowering women, and education reform, public education funding, and all of those things. So my birthing into movement, in a sense, was my birthing into this world. It was my birthing into the way I was taught the faith, that there's no way to be a person of faith, a spiritual person, and not be engaged in challenging the issues of injustice. In fact, one of my seminary professors taught me this. You can call whatever your spiritual experience is, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, baptized, sprinkled, meditative, fire of the spirit, but whatever you call it, he said, if it does not produce a quarrel with the world's injustices and the quarrel with the way the least of these are treated, and women are treated, and children are treated, and immigrants are treated, and all of those that the Bible says, more than 2,000 scriptures in the Bible I read, have to do with how we treat the least of these, those on the margins, and where we stand. Do we stand on the side of the forces of brute power, or do we stand on the side of those who are battling for power to be used for good and used for justice and equality?
Your work is incredible, and especially recently, you have revived the Poor People's Campaign. Would you like to tell us a bit about that?
Well, I led the NAACP in North Carolina for 12 years, and during that period of time, we built something called the Forward Together Moral Movement, which then evolved into Moral Mondays, when we were challenging a very, very extremist governor and a very, very extremist state legislature. And in very much, I tell people,
Texas. We know something about that in Texas too.
Okay. And I tell people, we saw Trump before Trump came. We just saw him in a governor. We saw McConnell before McConnell there. We saw Ted Cruz before people, we saw it in North Carolina in the state legislature. And you all, of course, have seen it in Texas. And we brought together people of all different races, creeds, colors, faith and not of faith, around a 14-point agenda that began with the issue of poverty, but also said there were 5 issues. You had to deal with race, systemic racism in all of its forms, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Now, we didn't frame them quite that way then, but they were very much similar. We later on, framed them that way, and I'll talk about in a moment, for the Poor People's Campaign. And it was a long-term campaign. It took us 4 years to beat back some of the worst voter suppression laws. I think Texas had the worst voter suppression law before Shelby. We had the worst one right after Shelby. So Texas and North Carolina were test case. You won some things in Texas. It took us 4 years after the Shelby decision that allowed states to do things without pre-clearance to beat back those laws. We've now won, beat back most of them. And the courts have actually said that what we experienced was surgical racism. And they said it created, through racist gerrymandering, a unconstitutionally constituted General Assembly. That's what the judge said. So we had for 4 years an unconstitutionally constituted General Assembly making constitutional decisions. And it's just reprehensible. But this business of bringing black and white and brown people together, you know, white poor folk from the mountains of Appalachia in North Carolina, black folk from the lowlands of North Carolina, Latino people from the Midlands, all together across the was powerful. And people said they hadn't seen it quite like that in the South particularly. We started Moral Monday with 17 people who got arrested in the State House. And and that was in April of 2013, by 2014, 100,000 plus people showed up in the streets. And it kept growing and it kept going. It was every week, and it was diverse all the way through. And we had a voting component and a registration component and a legal component. And we battled and we won. Well, when we were in the middle of, in 2016, I decided to do a sabbatical at Union Seminary. I had helped a sister named Reverend Dr. Liz Steele Harris, who's the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. But I said I needed some time to think about what do you do next? And when I went there, short story, started meeting with some rabbis, going through the scriptures in the Bible that dealt with economic justice, met with some imams, met with some Christian theologians, prayed about it, thought about it, and Liz Steele Harris and I got together and said, why don't we combine the work of the Kairos Center at Union and the work of repairers of the breach and this whole idea of moral fusion, and talk to people about the need in the 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, not to have a memorial service, but to have a revival of it, because the issues are still with us and still so prominent. And that's what happened. And when we announced it, we first did a moral revival tour. We came to Texas. We planned to do six of them. We ended up 7 of them. We ended up having 30 some invites. We did 26 of them in 6 months around the country. We did these trainings called Moral Political Organizing Leadership Institute Summit Training. Then we do these moral revivals at night, and people just came out, 500, 1,000 people online at the tune of 30, 40, 50,000 people. And then Trump got elected. And people were saying, what do we do? What do we do? And we said, well, we're going to do what we were called to do. And so on New Year's Eve night, 2016, in DC, we announced. And we began building from there. And since then, you know, we've created the Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 Years After the Poor People's Campaign, developed a moral budget. We had we went all over the country. We now have 43 coordinated committees in states, one in District of Columbia, work going on in 47 states. We did a launch in 2018, and for 6 straight weeks in 40 states, we had people engaging at state capitals, taking in the demands of the Poor People's Campaign under those 5 rubrics that I mentioned. And over 5,000 people got arrested, over 50,000 people participated, several million online. And then we launched formally the campaign with 40, 50,000 people in DC in June of 2018. Then we had a Congress. We created something called the Moral Poverty Action Congress. We said if they have CPAC, we need more impact. And our Congress brought together poor and low wealth people, moral leaders in DC. We were the first gathering of all 10 of the presumptive candidates for president at that time for the Democratic side. We invited both sides of the aisle. And then we presented before Congress a budget out of that Congress. And now we have, we'll talk some more about it, but this past June 2020, we had the Mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington. It was supposed to be in Pennsylvania Avenue. We couldn't because of COVID. We had it online. Some people said we might get 150,000 people, 200,000 people to attend. We had over nearly 3 million people who came on. And over 500,000 people took issues because, as I goes here, there's no way in the world people understand that we can ignore 140 million people in poverty before COVID, 700 people dying a day from poverty before COVID, and at the same time being in a country where we have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965, the passing of the Voting Rights Act. You just can't ignore those things and think somehow that your democracy or your society is going to be okay. And so that's where we are, and that's some of the genesis of how we got to be and how I got to be involved. Again, it was called. I was called into it. I didn't just wake up one morning and say, let's just do MLK. In fact, one of the things we do is we don't say we revive the Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King started, because the popular media presentation is that Martin Luther King started it. The actual reality is it was the National Welfare Rights Women.
Women.
I want Annie's list to hear it. Now, Dr. King had it in his mind, of course, certainly when he did the speech at Riverside, and he connected racism and poverty and militarism. I'm not saying he wasn't clear. He certainly did a piece on the To America. But it was the National Welfare Rights Women that had been working on these issues a long time. And they came and they said, we need to do this together. It was a Jewish federation. It was Cesar Chavez. It was white people from Appalachia, like Al McShirley and those who have been organizing among white people in Appalachia. They all came together and said, it's time for a Poor People's Campaign. And we decided that it's past time to finish that work.
Well, thank you for reviving that work, and also thank you for lifting up coalitional work. We know that's so important. I would love to have one of our audience members join us and address a question to you.
Okay, thank you.
We have Pam Benson Owens in Austin. Pam, are you with us?
I am. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. What's your question for?
My question is, what do you think is the responsibility of the church when it comes to politics?
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad that Ms. Brooks, and by the way, Ms. Brooks, I started to tease you about this too. My grandmother was a Brooks. There's a whole group of Brooks in North Carolina. I don't know if that's your maiden name or your married name. And the Brooks are a big part of the Tuscaroran Indian tribe, which I have relationship to. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Well, not only are you a Texan, but we might be cousins.
I'm telling you. And my grandmother was a great fighter, a great warrior as well, my great-great-grandmother. But to your question, you know, one of the things we do in the Poor People's Campaign and with Repairers of the Breach was founded particularly to inspire movements, and it grows out of the scriptural calling in Isaiah 58 that the real kind of fast that God wants is not for us to just go through religious services. There's nothing wrong with those things, but if it's not connected to justice and repairing the breaches and the brokenness, then actually the scriptures say in Isaiah 58, it is something that God distastes. In fact, people of faith are required to, if you will, sound the trumpets of Jubilee. And the trumpets of Jubilee are not the sounds of dancing, but the sounds of justice and the call for justice. When Jesus started his ministry, he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. He put in the center of theology and the center of the work of people of faith, minister to the poor. And the word that's used for poor in that scripture is a very specific word. There's three of them in Greek, but the one word that's used is ptokos, P-T-C-H-O-S, which means those who've been made poor by economic exploitation. And for Jesus to say that was the antithesis to the politics of Caesar, the politics of the narcissist at the time who sat on the throne, who loved to build temples and put his name on them and always lied and controlled the Senate. You know, his name was Caesar. Caesar. And Jesus says, listen, to follow me is not to follow Caesar. To follow me is to care about the poor, the brokenhearted, the sick, the blind, the abused, the imprisoned, and all of those who've been made to feel unacceptable. And then at the end of his life, he said, every nation, not individual, would be judged by how do you treat immigrants, how do you treat sick people, how do you treat the poor, the hungry, the naked, and those that are called the least of these. So the politics of God says there is no way to call oneself a person of faith, i.e. church or whatever, and then have a blind eye to the issues around us, or to simply suggest, as folk at Dallas Seminary and a lot of those who, like Jeffers and others in Texas, say that it's just people's moral failings. And if they just pull themselves up. No. Faith in the scriptures, whether it's in the Quran or in the Torah or in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, has always said faith requires a focus and a challenge to the injustices of this world. In fact, over and over again, the scriptures actually said most of the time when there's a lot of injustice, it's because the cultus of religion has decided to be the chaplain of the state rather than the prophet and the critic to the state. So in the Bible, the religious cultus, i.e. the church, temple, the priesthood, the ministers, are often blamed when things go wrong and when the poor are not treated right, for not doing their job, for engaging in a form of theological malpractice at best and heresy at worst. And so people of faith are supposed to be engaged. The church is supposed to be engaged. And sadly, sometimes that has not been the case. The repairs of the breach not only works with people not of faith, but we work with people of faith to say we have to have a movement in this country. It's not about left and right. It's not about Democrat and Republican. Now, that's different politics. It's about moral fusion. It's about moral analysis, moral articulation, moral action. It doesn't mean we don't vote at times based on party, but our principles aren't rooted in party. Our principles are rooted in our deepest moral values of the scripture, at the deepest moral values of the example of Jesus and the prophets, and the deepest moral values of our Constitution. What we really say to America is, listen, lastly, in the scriptures, how you treat the least of these is a critical issue. In the Constitution, it says that the first premise of anything you do if you swear to uphold the Constitution should be establishment justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, ensuring domestic tranquility, and equal protection under the law. So let's take these principles like a grid, lay it on top of every piece of public policy. Then add to that the Declaration of Independence that says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it says if any government is not doing these things, the people have a right to alter that. So take all of those moral, sound, foundational pieces that come out of scripture, come out of the Constitution, come out of Declaration, and lay it on top of each piece of public policy. If that public policy doesn't establish justice, if it doesn't provide for the common defense, if it's not rooted in love, not rooted in truth, if it does not ensure, if it does not, give life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then it's wrong, it's immoral. And people of faith should be challenging and standing up. That's how I believe that we should be engaged. And to not be engaged is actually in that context to deny one's faith. And that's why we challenge also religious nationalism. Because religious nationalism and white evangelicalism, I'm an evangelical, so I don't say evangelicalism just generally, but the kind of religious nationalism and white evangelicalism that was picked up by the Southern strategy and promoted by people like Falwell and Jeffers down in Texas. That's why we say, basically, when they say the only moral issues are being against women's right to choose and being against gay people and being for guns and being for tax cuts and being for prayer in the school, first of all, they don't find any justification for that in scripture. So they say so much about what God says so little and so little about what God says so much. But more further than that, it's actually a form of heresy. It's actually a form of theological malpractice because it's the counter of what we're called to be as people of faith.
That is such a powerful link that you're making between faith, between our constitutional foundations and the work that we are called to do within our politics. Really incredible.
I'm gonna make one. My father used to say that while the writers of the Constitution, I'm just sitting down, were deeply flawed individuals, deeply flawed individuals. He used to say the Holy Ghost though got in the room and made them write some stuff. If they knew the consequences of it, they wouldn't have written. Like this Constitution can be amended. Because, they had to make a lot of compromises with the South and people from this to get that Constitution signed. Things like the Second Amendment that allows slave patrols, which were the police of those days, the Electoral College, 3/5 Amendment, 3/5 Compromise, other things that they forced into the Constitution. But they could be amended. right? They could be changed, they could be altered. It was almost as though something happened in those rooms that let them know they knew they were wrong. They knew they were wrong. They knew, and they weren't so much Christians as they were theists. Many of them were theists. But the fact of the matter is, you see some interplay. Now, it's not perfect. In my tradition, my scriptures certainly, I lean to them greater than the Constitution, but I'm not trying to make America a theocracy. What I'm trying to say, as a person of faith, we have to be engaged. Churches, faith communities have to be engaged. And you can't find any fundamental shift in this country that did not have a moral movement somewhere in the middle of it, from the abolition movement to the Reconstruction, to the women's suffrage movement, to the union movement, to the civil rights movement. But you also can find another tributary. All of the evil in this country found a way to hijack faith. So you had slaveholder religion, and you had Frederick Douglass Christianity, which is why Frederick Douglass said, I love the Christianity of Jesus, but I hate the religion of the slaveholder. And all of the bad forms of religiosity that we see existing even today trace their roots to both slaveholder religion and the religion that allowed for the genocide of indigenous people. That's why America has to do some deep repenting in our religious bodies, and we're so wrong if we don't engage, but we begin to make things right when we do engage on the side of justice.
Well, I really love the observation. They knew they were wrong. I believe that's true, and I feel like part of the problem these days is too many people act like they don't know they're wrong.
Which is one of the great, that points to sometimes the great failure of the church, because they're going to churches and not being convicted. I mean, You think about it, the fact that the matter is Trump can come to Texas in the time when he's allowing people to die, in a time when he's lying, in a time when he's blocking healthcare, in a time when he's engaging hurting poor people, in a time when he's building walls. And though the scripture has 20 to 2,000, 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that say those things are wrong, he can come to a church and the church prays for him they pray for him, P-R-A-Y, while he's praying, P-R-E-Y, on the very people that the faith says don't do that, and nobody challenges him. And it would be just as wrong if it was a Democrat. It doesn't make any difference. But the fact of the matter is, as Dr. King said, the church is never supposed to be the thermometer of a society.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to be the thermostat.
Mm-hmm.
It's not supposed to measure the temperature. It's supposed to change the temperature, right? And so is the Constitution. The Constitution is not supposed to say, well, what do the people, if a majority of the people want it, then it's constitutional. No, the Constitution is written in such a way that if one person's rights are violated, it's wrong. It's not about majority, because if it was rooted in majority, then most of the things we hold dear now we would have never won through a vote. We had to win them through the court based on the Constitution.
And you have recently released a report on how poor voters can shift the political landscape and make a difference in our elections, in particular, ousting Caesar Trump.
You picked that up. You're quick. You are my cousin. Yeah.
Talk to us about some of the findings of that report.
It's funny that you picked that up, because you think about Caesar in the Bible. Caesar built walls. Caesar killed children, all trying to stay in power. Mm-hmm. Caesar locked people up that knew the truth. Caesar controlled the Senate. Caesar put his name on money. I was thinking about that the other day when Trump put his name on the checks. I'm saying, this guy's like Caesar. In fact, we were at the Congress one day presenting, and this Republican legislator got mad that we were there with stoles on that said Jesus was a poor man. He said, I've been a Christian all my life, and I'm just appalled that you all would come here with those stoles on and present to this committee about the poor. The Bible said the poor will be with you always. So my friend said, wait a minute, the Bible said the poor will be with you always, but you didn't read the rest of it because of the way people treat justice. And then he kept talking. He said, well, I've been a Christian all my life, and I've never seen anywhere in the Bible where Jesus challenged Caesar. And he said that like that was something proud to say. And I caught it real quick. I said, excuse me, sir, excuse me, point of order. Can I say something? Did you just identify yourself as Caesar? I said, we have a bigger problem if you actually think as a congressperson, you're Caesar and we're Jesus and we don't get to critique you. First of all, that's not true that Jesus never critiqued Caesar. Caesar was the one that killed him because everything Jesus did was contrary to what Caesar stood for. But you actually see yourself as Caesar? Now I said, now I understand now what the problem in America is. And I use that as a bridge to say Caesar did despise the poor. And they saw the poor as a nuisance. Mm-hmm. Caesar believed you'd put the poor in coliseums and use them for fun. Cicero, who was a great ancient poet in Rome, said that the poor were the dregs of the city. They were to be pushed aside, pushed down, and pushed away. Now, in America right now, we have 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country, as I said earlier. 61% of all African Americans are poor and low wealth. That's 26 million people. About 30% of white people are poor and low wealth. That's 66 million people. There's 40 million more poor white people than there are poor black people in raw numbers. But the disparate impact in percentage is 40% higher. 68% of Latinos and indigenous people are poor and low wealth in the wealthiest nation in the country, in the world. That's 43% of the nation before COVID. Columbia University did a study some time ago, said 700 people die every day from poverty. That's every 2.5 minutes before COVID. Somebody was dying from poverty and low income. 87 million people underinsured or uninsured before COVID. We're the only country of the 25 wealthiest countries that does not provide some form of health care that's connected to your humanity and not to your job. 4 million families get up every day and can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water, not just in Flint, Michigan, but all over this country. Before COVID, we spent $800 billion a year in the war economy. 53 cents of every discretionary dollar went to the war economy, buying the military things it doesn't even ask for, and only 16 cents of our military budget, 16% of our discretionary budget goes to healthcare, infrastructure, education, wages combined. One military contract for, say, Boeing or someone could pay for every southern state, so Texas being one of them, that has denied expanding healthcare. We've given trillions of dollars of tax cuts to the wealthy. When COVID was announced, the wealthy got $2 trillion almost immediately. 83% of the first CARES Act bill that was signed off by Democrats and Republicans went to corporations because McConnell wouldn't let anything else go through. 83% of the money. There's not been one bill that's been passed since COVID that guarantees sick leave, guaranteed unemployment, guaranteed rent forgiveness, mortgage forgiveness, guaranteed a moratorium on people's water being cut off. None of that. We call people essential workers, but treat them like they're expendable. We call them heroes, but treat them, as one woman said, like zeros. And in the midst of COVID, we found out that America has two fissures, and that those fissures are systemic racism and poverty, through which this virus has literally taken hold and it has been given more power. Now, why I say all that? Since COVID, the numbers of poverty have gone up to over 175 million people and growing. The poor were in a Great Depression before COVID. We just didn't talk about them because Democrats talk about middle class, Republicans have tended to talk about the trickle down. Democrats talk about from the middle class up neoliberalism that never really deals with the poor. Democrats have tended to run from poverty. They talk about people trying to get in the middle class. They don't really say the word since Lyndon B. Johnson. Republicans say racialized poverty is brown people and black people, and it's their own personal problems, right? So now we're probably headed to 175 million. So we're talking about a great destruction, not a great depression. We're talking about another 27 million people have been added already without health care because they lost their health care. That means we're about 114 million people underinsured and uninsured in the wealthiest nation in the world. We tried a few weeks ago to get them to vote for 10% of the military budget to be used now, just 10% for health care and whatnot. Could only get 90 votes. Republicans and Democrats could only get 90 votes, 90, that's all. Now, but what is not also not being seen is that the only hope to fully transform this democracy is to expand the electorate. And the only place it can be expanded is among poor and low-wealth people. And this study we just did called Unleashing the Power of the Poor says something else. Not only are the poor faring bad, but the poor have tremendous power. And I'm gonna give you some numbers. In our report that was done, it was clear that in the last election, 37 million poor and low-wealth people who could vote didn't vote. And two reasons. One was voter suppression, the other was because many of them never hear their issues. So there were 37 million poor and low-wealth people of 100 million people that stayed home that could have voted, that didn't vote. Put that in context. Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by 79, 80,000 votes. 2.1 million poor and low-wealth people that could have voted did not even vote. 2.1 million, all right? The study went on to show that in 15 states, Texas included in one of them, if the poor and low-wealth people that can vote were mobilized around an agenda, and you expanded their vote to just 19%. Most states is under 15%. Texas is way under 15%. If you could just expand the number of poor people that voted by 1 to 19%, and they voted around an agenda of uplift, an agenda to address these issues, you could fundamentally change the outcome of the election in the presidency and in the Senate. Right now, there's a conversation going on about the Electoral College, and it's saying, even if Donald Trump is at 40-some% in the poll, it's still possible for a person to win the popular vote and lose because of the Electoral College. Part of the reason of that is because the Southern strategy that was developed by Richard Nixon has been used by everybody on up to Trump. Trump is not something, he didn't just happen. He's the iconography of a too often repeated reality, according to a Princeton historian. But what has happened is Democrats have far too long left off 13 former Confederate states. They leave us to fight in the states, but they don't really see those as battleground. And what that means is they give up 170 electoral votes.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter who's running. If they're running on the Republican side, they start out with 170 votes to a race of 270. That's ridiculous. When in fact the demographics of poor white people and poor brown people and poor black people could fundamentally change that, and it would take less than 20%. You don't even need to get to 30%, just 19%. 19% of increase of poor and low wealth people in every southern state would change the South completely. Completely. And it's not impossible because Dr. King told us in '65 at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March that every time the bourgeois, the Bourbon class and the aristocracy class since the 19th century has seen the possibility of black poor people and white people able to form political power together, they sow division out of fear to deliberately set them apart from others. But what he said is, but we can beat the fear, but you gotta take the time to go among the people, which is why our campaign is organizing in Appalachia and in Alabama. We're bringing people together across all these racial lines. And we don't, and people say, well, it's too hard, you can't get 100%. We don't need 100%. This study shows 1 to 19%. In most states, under 10%. In a few states, under 15%. In North Carolina, it takes 19%, but in Michigan, 1%. In Texas, I think it may be 7 or 8%. I'm not sure the numbers right now, but what I do know in Texas, you got 70, you have 47% of Texans are poor and low wealth. That's 12 million people. What I know is that 59% are people of color, that's 9 million people. 49% are women, that's 6.7 million. 49% of Texans that are poor are women. 4.2 million Texans are uninsured, the most in the country. 5.3 million Texans make less than $15 an hour. So if you have candidates that start running saying, if you elect me, you're gonna get health care, you elect me, you're gonna get $15 an hour, and then they can show that if people are paid $15,000 an hour, guess what? You would pump $368 billion into the economy. It's actually good, right? It's not a negative. It's actually a good thing. If you just increase that, let me see, it's 12 million poor and low wealth people in Texas, of 59 million people of color, that's children of everybody. But you take that just 7 to 8% expansion, and 75 million of all poor and low wealth people are women. And 1/3 of all poor and low wealth people are in the South. So if we want to stop the power of the Electoral College until we can get it out of the Constitution, if progressives really want to win, you cannot win just with a neoliberal argument. You cannot win being afraid to talk about poor. You've got to show how poverty among 140 million people, 43% of the nation before COVID, over 50% after COVID, cannot be ignored. It's a detriment to the whole society. No society can ultimately stay whole with that many breakages and cracks in its bottom. It's just not possible. But if you flip that over, we actually have right at our grasp right now, especially in COVID. COVID, somebody said the pandemic has exposed the pandemonic of the denial of healthcare and the denial of poverty. And if we expose the pandemonic and show that poverty hurts us all, that systemic racism hurts us all, that racist voter suppression may be targeted at Black people and brown people, but it ends up allowing people to get elected. Once they get elected, they hurt white women, they hurt white workers, they hurt white people. In fact, in some ways, they hurt them more, because voter suppression allows a person to get elected by race, but once they get elected, they block healthcare, and in every southern state, the majority of the people in raw numbers that would benefit from Medicaid expansion are white. In percentages, Black and brown, but in raw numbers, is white.
Yeah, this is exactly the type of shift in the sort of conventional wisdom of politics that needs to happen. And you talk about the Electoral College, you talk about the Senate, Mitch McConnell.
Oh, Lord, excuse me.
Obstructionism. I'd actually love to bring in another member of our audience for a question. We have Jamar Brown. Jamar, are you with us?
Yeah.
Hi, Royce, I'm with you.
Because I battle ankylosing spondylitis, so I move. I'm a hard interviewer because I sit up and down, but just bear with me.
Absolutely.
Hi, Royce, I'm with you.
Great. Hey, Jamar, what is your question for Reverend Barber?
Sure. Thank you, Royce, and thank you, Reverend Barber. And I want to follow up on what Royce was mentioning about Mitch McConnell. We have a lot of obstructionist leaders who have placed racist policies in our country. And so what can we be doing right now in and outside of the election to get rid of those type of leaders so that we can begin taking down some of the racist systems and legislation they've put in place?
Well, let me even be more microscopic. And this is me talking. Poor People's Campaign doesn't endorse, but we're very political. We're nonpartisan, but very political. Let me talk. Let's go from macro to micro. There are a lot of them, but there hadn't been one like Mitch McConnell since the days of Jim Crow. Let's be clear about that. We're talking about one man that had used the power of one office. And the truth of the matter is, Trump is powerful because Mitch McConnell is pitiful. Trump is powerful because Mitch McConnell is pragmatic. Trump is mean because Mitch McConnell has a methodology of destruction. No Mitch McConnell, Trump would not be doing the things he's doing. And McConnell gets a pass because he doesn't engage in the antics, the name calling. But Ibram Kendi, in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, tells us something we need to learn. Racism has never just been about name calling. The name calling were the things added to the racist toolkit to get people focused off the real issues of policy. So Trump is out there saying all this crazy stuff. The media follows Trump. Mitch McConnell is stacking the courts with people that don't even believe in women's rights to choose. They don't even believe in the Voting Rights Act. They don't even believe in Brown versus Board of Education. And they believe that the courts should be skewed toward corporations. Mitch McConnell is using the issue saying that he's against a woman's right to choose, but the real issue, what he wants on the court, are judges that will side with corporations, because 83% of the decisions that he's helped place, 80-some% of the decision of the judges that he's helped place on the court were to give corporations more power over people. to Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell has the ability, because of the way the Constitution and rules of the Senate have been written, that he can put everything under his desk and it never move. But Mitch McConnell is worse than Strom Thurmond. I want you to know your history. Strom Thurmond was the leader and the developer of the Southern strategy, what has actually produced Trump and all of this stuff that we see today. All of this racist gerrymandering, all of this control of the South was produced by Strom Thurmond out of South Carolina, who was a deep racist, but he had a black baby. That's a whole nother story, okay? He preceded Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham is akin to Strom Thurmond, but we call Strom Thurmond a racist because Strom Thurmond blocked passing the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for one day. And he was lifted up as the hero of segregation because he blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act 57 for one day. Strom Thurmond Mitch McConnell has blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 2,590 days.
Wow.
Hear what I'm saying now? Over 2,590 days. He has literally since June 25th, 2016, put fixing the Voting Rights Act under his feet in his desk and refused to move it. All the stuff you were fighting in Texas, all the stuff we've had to go to court that could have never been pre-cleared, it doesn't trace to Tim Cruz, even though he's a mentee of McConnell. It's McConnell. It's McConnell. McConnell has thousands of bills he has blocked. He has refused to let living wage come to the floor. Hear what I'm saying now. He's not saying, I'm gonna let it be voted on and we're gonna vote it down. He said, I'm not even gonna let you talk about it. He was the one said, I'm not going to pass another bill until corporations that are protected from liability. In other words, if corporations force people to go to work in lethal situations, he said, I don't care how many people are unemployed. It can be 30 million people employed, 27 million people without health care. I don't care. This is what I want. I want liability protection for corporations. I want $27 million more $1 billion for F-35 airplane. I want $250 billion more in tax cuts. Because he knows that his friends, wealthy folk, greedy folk that he caters to, have made $755 billion during COVID already, and probably more. So if we're serious about this, McConnell has to move, and we have to change the Senate. That's why this election cannot just be about Trump. Mm-hmm. And it cannot be Democrats just trying to be centrist. What they got to do is put our moral issues at the center. And they got to fight in the South. And we have the possibility of changing Senate seats. Texas, Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina. Even in Tennessee, a young lady who's with the Poor People's Campaign, she ran and won the primary in Tennessee. And in Kentucky, there's a possibility, because yes, Trump, God knows, I believe he should move today if he could. But if you move him and you leave McConnell has already said on the tape, and I'm gonna quote him as best I can paraphrase. He said, I'm telling you that if I'm still the majority leader in the Senate, no matter what happens in this election, even if the presidency chooses, if I'm still the majority leader, you can refer to me as the Grim Reaper. If I'm the last man standing, none of this stuff, this is what he said, none of this stuff, this socialist stuff, will ever even be talked about. Now, prior to him saying that, he had been discussing healthcare, union rights, living wages, and voting rights. None of this stuff. So to your question, my brother, yes, it's a lot of folk, but there's never been one like McConnell since the days of Jim Crow. McConnell, Trump in some way might be the criminal, but McConnell drives the getaway car.
That is a powerful image and all too true. Clearly we have so much more work left to do, and you're right, it is not just at the top. It's not just the presidency. It's up and down the ballot.
And Ms. Brooks, thank God it's not left up to Kentucky. See, here's the good news. Poor people can do this. If the party and progressives say, I hope that's what's going to happen this weekend, we can literally signal a third Reconstruction. And you can organize poor people, and it's not going to run other folk away when you make the case clear that if we don't address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, and the war economy, it hurts the whole economy. And we can see that clearly in this pandemic. We can see it now. Things that people wouldn't talk about before, they can talk about now. And thank God we can no longer say we don't have the money, because all of a sudden they found $2 trillion for greedy folks. So that's off the table now too. We don't have to raise taxes. They didn't raise taxes to get that $2 trillion. So we don't have to talk about raising taxes. We talk about what we have to do as a matter of national security, and not to address racism and healthcare are now in the midst of pandemic national security. And if we do that, if say McConnell wins Kentucky, I don't think he will, because I think people are sick of him out there too, from coal miners, from the hollers to the hood. But if he does, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, with a few other places, not in the South, have the power to sit him on the back bench and watch us undo everything he did.
Absolutely. And you talk about, before COVID and after COVID, and just how much this pandemic has laid bare. It also really is, a rough time for so many people right now. As a spiritual leader, as a reverend, what is your guidance for folks about how to take some meaning out of this moment, about how to move forward within a moment that just seems so bleak for so many?
Well, one of the things I started doing even before COVID, and done it more now, is gone back and read the stories of things people went through worse than what we've seen in the past 3 or 4 months. I started reading what people did when you had a racist in the White House who denied a pandemic, the swine flu, in Woodrow Wilson. I had would have been an uncle that died. My grandmother lost a child to swine flu. And I've been thinking about, how did she make it? And that went on for 4 or 5 years. It ended up leading to the Great Depression. But it was in the midst of that Langston Hughes writes his poem, I Still Climbing. Life ain't been no crystal stair, but I still climbing, I still making way. And then the mother in the poem says, so boy, don't you give up. I look back at how I come from a people, as a person connected to indigenous, what we call Native Americans, who fought through genocide. When white ministers, like the Methodist minister that was a colonel who led one of the greatest destructions of an indigenous tribe, and he told the folk, kill them all, because even the children, because nits make gnats. And yet my people somehow survived. I come from Black people who not only lost people in slavery, but the millions of people who were lost on the Middle Passage. And yet they would sing a song, about trouble. Don't last always. And sometimes they would say, nobody's known the trouble I've seen. But then they would end that song saying, glory, glory, hallelujah. And somehow, even in the midst of slavery, when a baby was born, they go out and hold that baby up and say, nothing is greater than you but God. Or as Harriet Tubman, I think, said one time, they would look at a baby and say, maybe you is the one. I look in the scriptures that every pandemic in the scripture that comes up, where there's a pandemic, theologically, the pandemic forces major transformation, that the society is no longer the same. It is forced to face things that it never had to face before. And oftentimes in the scriptures, pandemics bring down Caesars and bring down pharaohs. It causes people to see one another as community in ways they did not see before. Pain has a way sometimes of bringing us together. And then lastly, I know that what we're seeing in this country was not inevitable. My daughter's an epidemiologist. She said, Dad, none of this had to happen. So as not Richard Wright, but I think his name will come to me in a minute. He was a great African-American writer, said if we made this world this way, we can remake it. We did this, we can undo it. Now that germ is powerful, but it's not so powerful either. It's deadly, but it also can be washed off with soap and water and warm soap and protected with a mask. You know, we are seeing ineptitude. We are seeing intentional, deliberate, government-sponsored murders. What one lady who says, I go to work every day in a nursing home feeling like I'm participating in my own mass murder because they don't have to treat us like this. Well, if this was done, if the response to the wrong response to this pandemic was done by man and humanity, it can be changed. We can change it. It doesn't have to be this way. We can come together. We can, as they said in the civil rights movement, overcome this. Now it's cost a lot. And that's the last part. We can't overcome it if we forget those that have died. Those that have died and suffered have to be the force, their remembrance. We have to remember them. We have to live for them. Remember them. Never let them die. They must live now in our votes. They must live now in our voice. They must live now in our challenge to injustice. So there's a group of us that have said, because I've had people, I've had like one family in my church that lost 12 family members all around the country. I've talked to some people who said, I'm not going to make it through this. But I've also had folk to say, keep on. And so some of us have said that what we heard with George Floyd, I can't breathe, was shorthand for what all of us are feeling. I can't breathe. There's almost like there's this weight trying to suffocate this democracy. That's why so many people responded to George Floyd. People were home, so they had more time, so they responded because they heard in his, I can't breathe, me neither. But then they said, we're going in the street and we're going to breathe. And we're going to try to breathe some justice and breathe some, we're going to remember him by breathing justice, by breathing equality, by breathing unity, by breathing participation, by breathing voting. And so some of us have said, this is our moment, how we're going to face this moment. Anybody that you talk to could be 48 hours from death in this moment. It is possible that COVID could hit you and you could be on a ventilator and in 48 hours you could be gone, taking your last breath. So some of us have decided, what do you do with that? Theologically, what do you do with that? So we've decided what we do with it. First of all, we remember those who've already died. We say we will never forget them. And in their name, in their memory, they will be us, we will be them. We will fight against the things that let them die. But the other thing is, we've decided we're going to live every day like we only have 48 hours of breath left, even if we live for 48 more days or 48 more years or 48 more whatever. And we're going to ask the question every day, if I knew I had 48 hours to live, what would I use my last breath for? What kind of love would I use my last breath for? What kind of justice? What kind of mercy? What kind of society? What kind of economy? And then we're going to live like that. Even if we have 48 more years to live, we're going to say, I don't have any more breath to waste on foolish things and things that don't matter. And so we're going to spend our time on things that matter, knowing that if we did this and people did it in our names and created this, we can undo it by the help and the grace of God. But we've got to commit ourselves to use this precious gift of life and breath to restore hope, life, justice, and maybe in some ways not even restore it, but to bring it for the first time to this American democracy. We need a revolution of values, a moral revival, and nothing less will suffice. And everybody that has breath that they don't feel like they need to waste it needs to be working to breathe into this society a new reality.
Reverend, thank you. This has been an incredibly uplifting conversation. We appreciate your time so much.
Thank you, cuz. I'll send you my genealogy. Yeah, all the folks, keep fighting and keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. God bless you all. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.